Welcome to day 9 of WOW Film Festival. I'm David Gillam, director of the festival, and we've been having a great time. I have to say, it's been an amazing 9 days, successful beyond our wildest dreams to see so many fully booked films. And tonight, we're looking a bit more deeply at Jean-Pierre Bekolo's Les Saignantes. And I'm really pleased that we have Rachael Langford here with us to talk us through this a bit, because it's certainly been a film that's raised questions with people. But for me, it was one of the great discoveries of programming the festival. What we're doing here is Rachel's going to talk for sort of 15-20 minutes now, and then we're allowing you time to watch the film, and I'm going to, grab a glass of wine and something to eat and sit and watch it. And then we're reconvening at 8:45 for a question and answer with Rachael and myself talking a bit more about the film. So I do hope you can join us for the whole evening. Rachael has been to the festival before, giving great introductions to particularly West African films. Rachael Langford is Professor of French and Francophone Studies and Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at Oxford Brookes University, she studies French literature and particularly West African cinema, as I said, is a great expert on that. So over to Rachael, who knows far more about this film and is, far more passionate and knows she's going to introduce it now.
Thanks, Dave. Very much appreciated. It's lovely to be here with everybody this evening, and I hope that you'll all enjoy the film as much as I do. So I have an assistant who's doing the slides for me, and I think probably without further ado, we might ask our beautiful assistant to put the slides up, if that's okay with Gareth. Fabulous. Thank you so much. Okay. So there are a few lines of inquiry that are useful for this film, and I thought what it might be helpful to do, because it is quite a complex film and it's quite an unusual film in some ways, unless you know Bekolo's work well. I thought it'd be quite helpful to give a background to the director. Some of you may know him, some of you may not, but just to situate a little bit the film within his works overall. Then to think a little bit about his particular conception of cinema, because the film is very much structured around some themes that occur across the whole of his work and which receive quite particular expression here in this film. And then I'll have a bit of a closer focus just on genre, and Bekolo references genre in all sorts of ways. It's really interesting to think about the film through the perspective of genre. And then we can't avoid talking about gender, particularly issues around women, female bodies, male bodies, and so forth, because the film goes large really on some of those themes. So if I could have the next slide then, Gareth. Thank you very much. So Jean-Pierre Bekolo was born in 1966. He's Cameroonian, a Cameroonian filmmaker. But actually, I suppose the thing I would want to emphasize most of all is the very transnational elements of his work, and the fact that he is also a kind of a multimedia creator. So he's a very well-known filmmaker and director, but also a producer of films, an editor of films, has worked in television, published a book in 2009 that was about the cinema, and has worked across both television series, documentary, as well as feature films. He did a first degree in physics, actually, interestingly, at the University of Yaoundé, which is one of the biggest cities in Cameroon, Francophone part of Cameroon, and then followed that up with cinema studies in Paris, in France, and has worked quite a lot in Canada as well. He's also been a visiting scholar at a number of North American universities, and often a kind of visiting filmmaker as well. And as you can see from the little timeline there, slightly odd because you have to go top bottom. So the first film he made was in 1992. He was quite young, 25, and that was a kind of smash hit. It was presented at Cannes that year, and continues to be shown to critical acclaim. Another film that I absolutely love from his early work is Aristotle's Plot, Le Complot d'Aristote, which really plays on issues around what is cinema, what is narrative, and the kind of Western influence of things like Aristotelian poetics on Western narrative in the cinema, and how could African cinema products kind of chart their way through that ground. And then the third film in this series is called Les Saignantes. It's slightly wrongly translated as the Bloodettes when you get it in kind of an English subtitled version, but we can talk about that in the question answer, what I think it should be. And then you can see that he has gone on to produce television programs, the book that I referenced from 2009, and other works. So continues to be productive. Le Président, the President from 2013, a film that's been banned in Cameroon for reflecting perhaps less than positively on the current political regime in Cameroon. So also from the outset, a filmmaker who is highly politically engaged, but in ways that really distinguish his work from perhaps a previous generation that some people might be familiar with, which was much more of a kind of socialist realist engagement with politics, was much more influenced by some of the great kind of Russian filmmakers and a particular tradition of kind of socialist realist cinema. I don't think that one would necessarily think of Bekolo's work as being socialist, but it certainly isn't realist either, as we'll see from Les Saignantes. I've put in here as well, if anybody's interested, Bekolo, Jean-Pierre Bekolo has a really interesting blog, WordPress blog, lots of very rich items there, just him thinking about colonialism, post-colonialism, nature of the post-colonial state and stuff. So I would really recommend it if you get a taste for his work. It's very, very interesting insight into some of his thinking. Okay, so if I could have the next slide, that kind of leads us on to thinking about Bekolo's vision of cinema for Africa. Why does he make the films that he does the way that he does? What's he reacting to? Being a massive Francophile in an age of Brexit, I couldn't resist putting the French in at the bottom in terms of the quotation for you, but I have translated it at the top. This is quite an interesting quotation that he gave in an interview when he was awarded a prize for some of his cinema work in 2015. And he's talking here really specifically about what is it that's lacking in African cinema. And he said that the cinema that we've been, by which he means kind of African directors, have been making up till now isn't our cinema. Our cinema still has to find its form, content, and language. It doesn't yet really speak to us, or to put it better, it doesn't show us anything. If the thousands of Nigerian films produced every year haven't been able to show us Boko Haram, what is a cinema that doesn't show, doesn't allow us to see? It still remains to be defined, and that's the real issue. And then I've just highlighted this bit because this is really the thread I'm going to follow a bit now for the next few minutes. This new African cinema will be defined, we will define it by seeking its form and content. So really in identifying a kind of insufficiency in African cinema to date, Bekolo is really thinking not so much about the stories that African cinema tells, but how it tells those stories. And that's really key to his whole kind of filmmaking, I suppose, kind of enterprise. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think you have to keep on clicking here, Gareth. Sorry, so thank you. It's got bullet points that come through. Sorry, I animated that rather unwisely, perhaps. So the first thing to note about the film should be clear from the outset is it's set in the future. Not very distant from us now, 2025, but when the film was made, it was set 20 years in the future. So a kind of what they call a kind of futur proche, a close future. And this notion of setting a film in a future, but a future that is still linked to the present, that is still quite recognizable, is really one of Bekolo's ways of questioning and undermining Western narratives about development and progress. And the film also sets up and kind of takes apart an opposition between what we might see as sort of science and technology, all these kind of European inventions. So, for example, the film shows cars that are automatic that you can just talk to kind of and they will drive for you. So the kind of driverless car that's it probably seemed quite kind of future forward in 2005. But the film also has a kind of strong elements of magic, of really kind of supernatural powers in it as well. So the film plays with this idea of what is futurism, what is modernity. And this is a quotation from an interview with Bekolo in 2012. There's always this idea that the past and future in Africa can't connect. Lots of you probably are aware of kind of, Hegel's unfortunate but very famous phrasing that Africa was a continent without history. So this idea that Africa has a past, if you don't have a past, how could you have a present or a future? So playing with some of these quite politicized ideas. And Bekolo says that because of this idea about the past and future in Africa not being able to connect, this surreal ambience in the film, in Les Saignantes, is also very African. It's not just about what you see, but also about what you have in your mind. This is particularly African. Even if the politics is important, it's not the only thing. And here this is thinking about the fact that for Bekolo, cinema is a way of thinking through things. So it doesn't necessarily provide answers. There are lots of questions posed in the film. The cinema doesn't necessarily provide answers, but it allows you to conceptualize things beyond what is presently available to us. So he identifies this as well by saying the film allows us to ask the what if question. The idea that we should be able to go with cinema as far as it can get us. I wanted this film, and he's talking about Les Saignantes, to push the limits of visual aesthetics of what you could do visually. And he also, in the same interview, refers to Les Saignantes as a film of anticipation, so kind of thinking forward, but impossible anticipation. Nothing that is in the film could actually really happen. So in terms of the genre, then this kind of Afro-futurism, it's a whole movement really, which uses sci-fi modes, kind of techno sci-fi modes to reflect really on political presence in the African continent. And Bekolo's work very much chimes with that in Les Saignantes. Can I have the next slide, please? I think this has also got animated bullet points, so you might need to click through a few times. Thank you. Okay, so thinking about some of the things that are really obvious in the film from the outset. I don't think that anybody will not see most of these in the film almost as soon as it kicks off. Very pervasive images, and not just visual images, but also sort of themes in the story around prosthesis, so sort of artificial bits added to the body. Decomposition and recomposition. I won't expand on that, I might give too much away. But all of these link Les Saignantes to genres of horror, sci-fi, thriller, and magic realist genres. If you listen to the film, if you just close your eyes at certain moments and listen to it, the soundtrack is used very deliberately to reinforce genre. So you've got both what's called kind of intradiegetic sounds, so sounds that would naturally occur through what the characters are doing in the film. Footsteps, gravel crunching, water running if they're standing next to a water source, but also extradiegetic sounds, so things that are nothing to do with the events that are happening. So very rhythmic music, ritual sounds, which don't necessarily correspond to anything that the characters are doing. And the soundtrack is often kind of moist and crunchy in a way that indicates kind of decomposition, recomposition, some kind of sort of abject aesthetics, I suppose. Another thing you won't fail to notice is the use of lighting. The film is really dark, so dark that sometimes it's actually quite hard to see. You feel like you need to turn the contrast up on the screen. There are lots of these what's called chiaroscuro effects in sort of art history. So like Baroque or Renaissance paintings where you just have a single light source, say a candle in a room, you get very thick, deep shadow and then kind of pools of light. So it's worth noting that the whole film takes place during the night. There is no daytime at all in this particular urban setting. We can talk about what that might mean. And then the two things to kind of juxtapose here, there are lots of really familiar visual tropes, that indicate genre. So you get kind of blinking fluorescent lights kind of going on and off like you often do in suspense films, and particularly Hollywood ones. Shots of the full moon, which we tend to associate with horror, really, werewolves, all that kind of thing. Cops staking out criminals, so a kind of real trope, I suppose, from the 1930s onwards in Hollywood film. And then kung fu style fights, which are very much a staple of, I suppose, kind of, Southeast Asian products, which are very popular with African audiences and have been for many decades. And then alongside what I suppose we as a Western audience, I'll kind of include myself there, certainly if most of your cultures from the global north would consider to be quite familiar tropes, there are a whole lot of tropes that are relatively unfamiliar if most of your film culture comes from Western Europe and North America. So lots of layered images, lots of stop camera, sped up, slowed down, sort of palimpsestic images, one thing laid over another, quite a lot of prophetic and ritual imagery. This isn't necessarily very unfamiliar if you've watched quite a lot of kind of Nollywood cinema. where there is an element of I suppose, a sort of performance of magic and so forth. But these two things, the kind of familiar genres and then these images which kind of break with that familiarity are sort of played with throughout the film. And then finally, and you will also notice this at kind of punctual points throughout the film, Bekolo uses a lot of intertitles. So I mean, think of kind of, you know, the old silent films from the beginning of the 20th century, where you would, you know, the narrative would disappear and you would have a kind of text on the screen. The text here doesn't blank out elements of the background. The texts are often integrated onto billboards or other spaces, as well as then integrated into the film. And the intertitles pose questions often about the meaning of what it is that we are watching, the significance of what it is that we're watching. And they break that fourth wall convention where, you know, what we are seeing is realistic, that there's no kind of break in the narrative, that the whole thing happens in a linear time, and directly address the audience so that the audience is implicated in this act of turning cinema into a space for thinking about you know, what is identity, what is representation, what is power in this particular situation. Okay, next slide, please. So that's the bit about kind of the aesthetics of the film in a sense, and that corresponds very much to Bekolo's vision of what cinema can do and how African cinema actually should be using visual aesthetics and the convention of cinema more thoroughly to explore possibilities. The other side of this film, the thematic side, I think that most people probably would have the biggest number of questions about, I suppose, is the presentation of gender. And it's really specific. Bekolo uses or kind of reanimates something that itself by the time the film is already dead, which is a set of rituals and esoteric knowledge called the Mevoungou, and this is referred to lots in the film. So I think it can be quite confusing. I was certainly quite confused once I first saw the film before I'd read about it as to what was going on. In the 19th century, the Germans colonized Cameroon, and they stamped out this particular practice, which was a set of rituals, esoteric knowledge, and kind of female initiation ceremonies in bits of the kind of you know, very long-standing cultural groups within what's now the nation state of Cameroon, which was focused on celebrating female power. And that celebration of female power was entirely fixated and focused on women's genitalia and female sexualities as a sort of restorative power. So in the film itself, there are some really strong homoerotic elements in the film between Mevoungou and Chouchou, the two female characters, some really foregrounded matriarchal aspects to the film. And all of this is inspired by this idea of the Mevoungou, but this is a set of ritual cultural practices that were already deceased by the time that Bekolo makes the film. So again, as part of this kind of connecting the past to the present to the future, he reanimates, but also reimagines this particular set of ceremonies, what they might mean for power, what they might mean for the post-colonial state. And the other thing to think about in this film is the way then that women are presented in it. So the two girls, Mevoungou and Chouchou, are foregrounded visually right from the off. They're often really scantily clad. They make use of their own sexuality, very deliberately, as a weapon and a source of strength. But at the same time, this isn't entirely utopian, really. There are limitations to this. So these two young women are almost under the power of an older set of matriarchs. They find themselves subject to the power of the Mevoungou. It's not necessarily something that they have chosen to channel, but which takes over their bodies, turns them into kind of weapons against the post-colonial state. Really interestingly, though, throughout the film, the female body, or the female bodies that we encounter, manage to remain all in one piece, or they're kind of prosthetically augmented. We'll see that right at the beginning of the film. But a lot of the male bodies in the film, and yeah, you may want to kind of pause or turn your eyes away a few times in the film. A lot of the male bodies in the film are either defunct, they're kind of dead, they're actual corpses, or they end up dismembered in some quite chilling and very kind of horrific, in line with horror genre ways. And then just one thing to note as well, that there isn't actually much that men can do against this female power, this kind of connected togetherness, intergenerational power of the Mevoungou. And at one point, one of the characters is kind of brandishing, what's often read critically as kind of a phallic gesture. So he's brandishing a gun, and really it has no power at all against this particular kind of set of rituals and esoteric knowledge. Okay, so I'll move on from that. Happy to take questions on it. It is quite complicated, and I'm not a specialist in this area at all, but I thought that might be useful in terms of some kind of lines of understanding. If I could have the next slide then, please. Okay, this is my last slide on gender then. So Bekolo was very conscious of the fact that in foregrounding young women's bodies, and they are relatively young in the film, he says, I shouldn't make a film where girls won't like themselves. I felt that it was important for the girls to like the way they look. And he references very clearly that there was something important about showing young women having agency and choice in choosing to use their bodies and their sexuality or choosing to weaponize them, rather than it being something that they were forced into. So even though young female bodies and sexuality are foregrounded in this film, there is we can debate, I guess, whether it's successful or not, but there's certainly an attention to avoiding exploiting how young women's bodies are portrayed visually. And this is part of a wider concern that Bekolo has around the representation of Africans on screen, and that Africans should have more opportunities to have agency over how they're presented. So he's also said in an interview, cinema has this function of helping people projecting themselves into a world. How can you get what you cannot see? I want young people to like the aesthetic. He's talking very much about Les Saignantes here, and to think that their environment can be changed. So the point of allowing the younger characters in the film to have choices about self-presentation really opens onto a wider point about the opportunity for Africans to take hold of the means of presenting themselves visually in cinema and in other fora, and to do something with that, to have agency in those spheres as well. And so the play with gender roles and aesthetic invention and creativity in Les Saignantes aims to allow Africans who come to see the film to know that, and this is another quotation, how Africa looks and is now isn't how it has to be. So again, referring to the film as a kind of think piece, a way of thinking through other possibilities rather than what is presented in reality in the present. Okay, another slide then, Gareth, if that's okay. I think you need to click through. Sorry, yes, there's more. Thank you. Just back one then. Lovely, thanks very much. So just to conclude then, in terms of some of the kind of, I suppose, big ticket messages for this film before we watch it, Bekolo's film is very similar to some of his other films. So Les Saignantes decomposes and recomposes barriers between what's art and what's politics, what's high culture, what's popular culture, and that's that's a chosen procedure. That's something that he does in full conscience that he's doing it, and genre, form, style are all part of this thinking piece. So it's not that all of the kind of political engagement is contained in the storyline, even though that's very powerful here in Les Saignantes. It's focused on gendered power relations. All of the aesthetic is really deployed as well in this direction of helping us to think through different possibilities contained within the present. And rather than giving just this kind of one political message, sort of saying, X or Y is right or wrong, Les Saignantes is questioning established messages and ways of understanding the world. So it directly poses questions to the audience, attempts to engage the audience in what does it mean to watch a film like this? What does it mean to be active in the world? So really kind of asking the audience quite searching questions. Bekolo's using the film to project forward towards new possible futures that require conceptualization beyond current imaginative horizons. So the point really is that the film won't provide us with closure necessarily. It doesn't end with an answer to some of the things that are happening, but it ends with a whole set of questions about what next, what if, what could be different. Yeah, okay. So that's my kind of concluding piece before we watch the film. If I could just have the last slide then, Gareth. Sorry, this is a little bit academic, but just in case anybody was interested in finding out more, because there's so much to say and little time to cover it all in, and the film is more interesting than the introduction in any case, I did think that people might want to follow up on a few different directions. So quite a few of the quotations from Bekolo that I've talked about today come from this YouTube video, which is an interview from 2012 with Bekolo talking specifically about Les Saignantes. There is a really interesting piece on what Afro-futurism is and the aesthetics of hope in Les Saignantes, and also another really lovely film called Pumzi, which is about the sort of generic side of it, about genre. And then a very excellent chapter by Naminata Diabate on precisely the Mevoungou, and some of the things that I've said come from this chapter in Augustine Agwuele's book on development, modernism and modernity in Africa. So I thought if anybody was interested and want to take a photo of the screen before I check out now for this part of the presentation, you are more than welcome to. And I do hope you enjoy the film this evening.
So I'm going to start with a bit of conversation with Rachel about the film. Obviously, she's a big fan, and so am I. Now I've been introduced to it. I thought it was visually amazing, and has this stunning soundtrack. So it was kind of quite an eye-opener to me. You said various things at the beginning about the aesthetics of the film and the kind of stylistically what he was trying to do and so on, but perhaps I thought we might just start with this rather odd title of The Bloodettes. You said you thought that wasn't a very appropriate title, or even maybe a mistranslation or something. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that? Because it's the one that makes people scratch their heads.
Yes, it's definitely a mistranslation because I'm going to sound like a terrible kind of linguistic nerd now. Saigner in French is to make something bleed, but you can also, so you can say je saigne, I'm bleeding, but you can also saigner something else, like to stick a pig in effect. And so les saignantes is both those who bleed, I think probably in the menstrual sense as well as in the sense of almost like I suppose more of a sort of piata type of thing, kind of martyrdom, but also those who can make others bleed. So it has a kind of double sense around power and femininity that is probably untranslatable, but it's quite a clever title, because like a lot of the things that Bekolo does, it kind of faces in two directions. It faces both outward and inward from the female body. So yeah, I try not to use any English translation because it kind of grates with me slightly. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I think we felt the same, really. Some titles in the festival, Tantas Almas, there's got an English title, Valley of Souls, and we've used that. But with this, it didn't sit right. So we just thought. I was sort of interested also in what you talked about. I mean, because this is a film that I've had more people say, what the hell's going on there? And I couldn't answer them, so I don't know what's going on either. But I'm quite happy to enjoy the ride, if you know what I mean. So that sort of feels. But you talked about Bekolo's idea of cinema as an instrument to think through things. And I was kind of interested, he had actually got a physics degree first. There are quite a few interesting directors who have science degrees first, but it's sort of almost like an idea of using the camera like a microscope or a telescope to investigate into something and see what's really lies beneath. And, I just want to talk a bit perhaps about, what he is investigating. So you said he wasn't really a socialist filmmaker, but he's clearly investigating social conditions and the sense of what the country stands for and where it might go. And there's something sort of poignant about the fact we're looking at 15 years later, and it seems equally relevant today, probably than it did as it did 15 years ago. So you just talk a little bit about that and his,
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's a kind of generational thing with some of the filmmakers as well. So I think, that many of you, I'm sure, know this really well. So that there are sort of almost like two generations of very well-known African filmmakers, and there's the kind of post-independence generation who I think still weren't disappointed by what independence had turned out to be, and still had this quite sort of almost utopic intent in making their films. It was to excoriate the past, to critique, kind of post-colonial elites, for example. I suppose I'm thinking about Somben amongst other filmmakers here, but who had a very sort of iterative filmmaking style. And were often criticised for being simplistic in filmmaking. And then there's another kind of group of filmmakers from really the same period, but who are often considered to be what's called sort of return to the source filmmakers, who used a whole traditional African past. And this would be people, I suppose, a bit more like Suleiman Cissé, who'd made films which return to myths and legends of the past. And actually, to some extent, Somben does that. And the newer generation of filmmakers who kind of grew up into filmmaking in the 1990s onwards have very much rejected that kind of aesthetic where there isn't much play, there isn't much inventiveness in the visual style, and but they haven't abandoned some of those, I suppose, investigations of tradition versus modernity. I suppose, to be very simplistic about it, some of those investigations about what is meaningful about African pasts now in the present, what is meaningful about the present for the future of Africa. So I think I wouldn't want to draw kind of, too simplistic, too much of a sort of dichotomous distinction between filmmakers like Bekolo and others who started making films in the 1990s and a previous generation of filmmakers. But there is definitely something around a desire to use all of the riches that film offers to explore some of these social issues, and perhaps less of a suspicion of art as play, or a sort of I suppose, that playing with the kind of representational aspects of film in a way that I think probably felt uncomfortable to those who are much more interested in social realities. And I think also this is a generation that are probably much more marked by a kind of transnational music video aesthetic. So certainly for a generation of filmmakers like Ousmane Somben and Suleiman Cissé, so that the kind of often called the fathers of African filmmaking from the 60s and 70s, grew up themselves with a very different, I suppose, sort of engagement with cinema with which they were surrounded, whereas I think a younger generation of filmmakers, it's odd to call somebody who's in their 50s a younger generation of filmmakers, but nonetheless Bekolo is part of that younger generation of filmmakers who came to filmmaking at the right in the last decades of the 20th century, and they are much more marked by the kind of playfulness of music video, by the transnational product that is Nollywood cinema that plays with quite a lot of these tropes as well. So I guess I wouldn't say that he's very careful what he says about politics, so I think it's difficult to call him a socialist filmmaker, because I think I don't think that for Bekolo, there is anything that isn't political. So it's difficult to talk about that parts of this film that are not political, because I think that he would see politics as about power, and both the visual aspects and the content of the film deconstructing, recomposing, engaging with what power is.
Yes, I mean, so you sort of, there's a generational thing, but also, I mean, he went to film school in France, and some of the African, fathers of African cinema went to Moscow and to Eastern European films, and obviously that social realist tradition was there, and some suspicion of, shall we say, playing with cinema or being aesthetically adventurous had been kind of, chiseled away as not sufficiently socialist or whatever. But I mean, I wonder, but he's still using kind of, as you said, strategies to break the fourth wall and to ask the audience questions very directly. And the most obvious one, in a sense, is the intertitles that come in and very directly say, how can you watch a film like this and not act, and so on. I mean, do you want to just talk about that and how that sort of fits with either his previous work, but also other people who've used that kind of mechanism to kind of say, look, you're watching a film. These are the questions you need to think about. Don't leave your brain at the door.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting actually, because Bekolo is he trained in, I think his specialism at film school was montage, and so it's interesting almost that he turns away from purely filmic means to make some of his points, and uses the texture within the film to be very explicit about some of the points he wants to make, without necessarily being particularly subtle in a way that we might expect, of course, given everything we've already said about the extent to which for him the aesthetic is very important, the extent to which he's trained with a specialism in filmic montage. So would one could leave those kind of questions latent in the film. It's not necessarily the case that the audience wouldn't have come to that conclusion without the intertitles. So there's a very deliberate attempt, I think, again, to engage with a kind of a postmodern aesthetics there, I think, in some ways. So it's also, we've talked about the extent to which the film focuses on the decomposition, recomposition, sort of prosthetic nature of bodies. But I almost have the sense in this film that Bekolo sees film as, or a film product, a creation almost as a body, which you could break apart, recompose, put into different places. And the questions that arise then, the intertitles, almost form that kind of break, a bit like the chainsaw and the axe that we see in the film taking apart the body of the SSCG, the kind of the cabinet secretary. The intertitles almost perform that real violence to the body of the film, that they are the biggest continuity break in the film. And so I think there probably is something there that is about this. A couple of people have written about the film have called it a kind of cyborgian aesthetics, that what you're dealing with is something that is both artificial and realist at the same time, that is both natural and artificial at the same time. And so there's definitely something there. It's not particularly subtle, and the questions themselves are almost kind of replicate each other. So it's a little bit like being shouted at, I think. And when there's so much else going on, and it's interesting because there isn't that much dialogue, and the dialogue isn't particularly rich. And it's I suppose a striking illustration as well. This is not a film that is about the psychology of Majoli and Chouchou. We don't really find out much about their motivations. There's no great, kind of breastbeating and wailing and kind of gnashing of teeth in the film about those particular characters. And yet, even though the dialogue between characters in the film is perhaps not particularly rich, there is still an attempt to engage the audience in a kind of rich dialogue while the film is in train. So I think it's quite interesting. Certainly in African cinema, as far as I'm aware, it's relatively unique as a repeated strategy within a film that is also already kind of multi-generic. And I suppose I kind of wondered why sometimes we hadn't also got address to camera. So it's quite interesting that the characters themselves don't actually step out of that filmic space, and yet the director kind of forces the film out of that naturalist filmic space just by the way that it's edited with the intertitles put in there.
Yes, and I mean there is also this sense, this question you raised really about the agency of the young women, and his idea that African young people have to have agency to think things can be changed, and there's that sort of sense of coming up against structures, and you're not quite sure whether they have agency or not, and then those kind of matriarchal figures for which I still don't have a kind of answer as to what's going on there. So I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about that, because it seems to be sort of somehow offering something that maybe it doesn't quite deliver, shall we say?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think as far as I understand it, Bekolo is kind of torn between hope and despair, and the film sort of walks that line between wanting to use both the agency that's latent within film as a medium, and to use the film to indicate that that young people for a new post-colonial Africa could have agency in particular ways, but also not being, I suppose, kind of ludicrously optimistic. It's very clear that even if it is feminine, there's still a gerontocracy here. So there is still, a tranche of older women, and the younger women kind of try and elude them, but they're always there phoning and sitting in the back seat of the car and watching them all the time. So there is that power dynamic which is intergenerational, and whether that's male or female, certainly the film shows that as almost being a default position that's very difficult to move away from. So even when gender dynamics might be, kind of fruitfully disrupted by the film, there's no real disruption of a intergenerational dynamic. And I think that's quite interesting. And I think that does lead one to reflect on, I suppose, whether this is an optimistic or a pessimistic film. So yes, it's possible to have agency, but if your elders are always going to turn up with a large cup of disgusting green liquid and kind of mealy bugs for you to eat, it's debatable how much agency you have actually got.
Yeah, there was a sort of interesting thing that they seem to have power over men, but not over older women. So there was a sort of, a disruption of it, shall we say. And, but the other thing, obviously, that's very obvious in the film is his sort of examining, kind of picking up almost and using and then putting down different sort of genre conventions and styles and sort of forms of filmmaking. And as you said, questioning our ways of understanding the world. So just talk a little bit about that, about why that, and I imagine that's probably central to his work throughout, having only ever seen this film. But, that sort of, that key thing that, we have to keep questioning what we see and is what we see what we think it is, and, all that sort of thing. So you want to talk a little bit about that and how he uses genres?
Yeah, so there are lots of ways of reading this, and depending on where one stands, I suppose, partly in sort of critical theoretical approaches to cinema. I think one of the interesting ways of reading it is as something that is considered to be very intrinsic to the sort of post-colonial state of the world. And in French, it's called bricolage. It means kind of, making do, producing things out of what's to hand. It has a kind of a sort of artisan aesthetic to it. So it's the idea of kind of crafting something out of what's available to you. But also, again, with a kind of, make do and mend kind of aesthetic that you can't necessarily buy all the post-production stuff that you might have available to you in Hollywood. And therefore, you're going to kind of play on the margins and with the margins of genre rather than fully invest yourself in a a kind of top flight, incredibly expensive genre movie. So I suspect it's a bit of a trope in contemporary African cinema anyway, and I think it's very particular to Bekolo. It both signals quite an interesting lack, a kind of, a lack of ability to make the full genre film because this is made in some very limited geographical space in a suburb of Yaoundé in over quite a limited number of nights, nights without a K, of nighttime shooting and without a huge amount of investment. So that play with genre, I think, is to keep the film sparky, relevant, interesting, but also to demonstrate the almost like the kind of strictures into the play within the space into which African film is often forced. But there's also an element to which I think it corresponds to, again, what we've seen in the film kind of discussing in terms of its narrative content. Genres are kind of Western inventions, really. They come from the very westernized history of cinema and what's often called the kind of industrial capital complex. Genres are there because they make films very recognizable to audiences. They help with marketing. They allow cataloging. They allow all sorts of kind of marketization of films and insert films within a very particular I suppose kind of hierarchy of value. Genres are probably the things that most people have expectations over. And I think alongside this idea about what are the discursive and kind of political possibilities for Africa, this desire to step both in and out of genres, to use genres but to kind of slough them off, abandon them, move forward, is also a way of signaling that film probably shouldn't only be about commercial making money, Hollywood industrial capitalist complex and cinema moguls and so forth. So it's also a way of, I think, another way of demonstrating there are riches to genre that haven't even been explored because the actual monetary riches of genre are always fully exploited, and that there are more interesting things to do aesthetically with the art of genre than simply to stand right in the middle of that big pool and articulate yourself as nothing but a horror film. So I think there's it's probably quite political, but I think it's also probably quite political through necessity. interestingly, the film that he made before, Aristotle's Plot, it's a super interesting kind of philosophical film about what is cinema, and it even has a character called Cinema who kind of circulates with great big old-fashioned reels of film in a shopping trolley. It's a really interesting film, and it plays on some of these themes. And that film, and one day when I have some time, I'd like to write something about it. That film has an awful lot of actual kind of textile collage in it. So a lot of this kind of collage effect of taking bits and pieces of material, of kind of material culture from other places, sewing them together, recomposing them, recirculating them around. So I think there's also something going on here in Bekolo's work about what are transnational cinema products. So when we think about the kind of kung fu fighting scenes, we know that African audiences have for many, many years been exposed to Westerns, kung fu films, all sorts of kind of action films from many other different cultures. And there's also something here, I think, indicating a big question mark over what is African film? So not only what can African film do, but what even is an African film? If all the film genres were defined already in the West in some period between, say, I don't know, 1890 and 1940, and if all the capital that accrues to film distribution comes from the West, and we can see who, it was, this film itself was kind of funded by TV5, a kind of big international French TV chain, amongst others, and the big Francophonie, equivalent of the British Council, really. What is African cinema? What is the genre of African cinema? What genres should it inhabit? Are there new genres, or are there only the off-the-peg genres that already exist that were invented in the West and are predominantly Western? So I think it's it is quite complex, this play with genre, and it's quite uncomfortable as well, I think, sometimes. And it makes the films quite tricky, I think, to position as things that are commercially successful propositions, because there's no real space. What is film if it doesn't have an audience, I suppose, and if your audience can only be generated by working within acceptable delineated boundaries, then you have to work with them to some extent, I guess. So there is something political about what he's doing with it, I think.
Okay, so political formally, as well as maybe within the content a bit, but subtly so, maybe in some ways. So I'm going to go to the audience and see if there's any questions, because we've been asking for quite a lot. And I'm just going to say, if people want to put their hands up, turn their camera on, they put their hands up, or you can use the reactions button on Zoom if you're familiar with that. Or if you want to, you can put your questions in the chat and type it in there if that's your preferred way of doing it. And so, with very few cameras on, I don't see anybody waving right now, so I may ask another question while something either types into the chat or comes up forward. Just talk a little bit too about, because it was shot on DV cam, it seems to have some of that creativity of having no budget, whereas clearly didn't have no budget, but using a lot of lighting effects to try and create things, and smoke, and as you said, the kind of pop video aesthetic and so on. But very often that's a way of kind of not got very long, not got very much money, better shoot something, get something in the can, do that, and the use of lighting on sort of sets or things that look, very kind of flat or whatever. So, but yet there is a whole industry spawned out of French TV and out of French cultural organizations, I guess, but which are, obviously in some sense colonialist projects. And yet he's a man looking for a interrogate a post-colonial state, shall we say. So just how do African filmmakers, particularly him, actually manage to kind of ride those kind of contradictions of wanting the money but not wanting necessarily the things that come with it?
It's really tricky, and I think it's continued to be very, very tricky. And I know that Bekolo has actually heard, when you look at his sort of filmmaking biography more recently, there are a number of projects that he wasn't able to actually have funded. So there are things that he has shot and never managed to get distributed, particularly things that he's done with students. He does quite a lot of work with North African universities, kind of filmmaking courses, and work that he has done with students which hasn't been distributed because it's probably, I assume, not commercially viable. I think language is really interesting. Language has been, you know, as many of you know, I'm sure it's one of the kind of biggest battlegrounds between sort of, I suppose what we might call kind of post-independence and post-colonial theorists, I suppose, and we know that many writers, I'm thinking of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I suppose, amongst others, have both written very polemically against using the language of the colonizer. The language of the colonizer restructures your brains, you know, in ways that alienate you from your own culture. That not being able to speak or create in the language that is your, you know, your mother tongue. Look, this is very resonant in Wales, I have to say as well. But not being able to kind of create in the language that is your mother tongue, you know, is uncomfortable, is a mark of oppression. Bekolo, I think, is he's less bothered by that, because the advantage of producing a film in French, of course, is that it reaches way beyond Francophone Cameroon. It reaches into all those educated young people from Francophone African colonies who would have been, for example, doing their secondary education through the medium of French. And that has always been the counter argument for not using some of the indigenous African languages. I mean, less so for something like Swahili, which has a very, very large number of speakers, but some of the languages that would perhaps be more geographically restricted, that as a filmmaker, you will get a bigger reach if you shoot in English, you know, and then multiply subtitle, or shoot in French and multiply subtitle. We know that Somben actually took the choice to move away from filming in French at all, and to use Wolof, so the language that he spoke from, majority language in Senegal, and to subtitle in the colonial language in order to reach people. It's not something that Bekolo actually ever refers to very often at all, and he is not somebody who seems to find problematic being funded by some of these very large, as you say, kind of European cultural organizations. And it's perhaps a generational thing. Again, it's not a generation that grew up under direct colonization, so maybe are more comfortable with sort of transnational funding flows, and with the acceptation that, you know, there are African varieties of French and English, that the language doesn't necessarily belong only to the colonizers, even if that's how it got to the continent. But we know that filmmakers from a former generation, the sort of, you know, the fathers of African cinema, were very uncomfortable with some of these things, but had lived directly under colonial rule, and had often experienced, I think, a school system that created, you know, hierarchies of you know, this is European French, this is the only French that is acceptable, rather than some of what we see. There's quite a lot of slang in the film. There's quite a lot of kind of linguistic tics, which are very much Francophone African tics that would be unusual if, you know, actually would mark you as Francophone African if you used them in France. But no uncomfortableness about taking money from wherever in order to make his films, I think. And I think that is, again, a reason why we might be reticent about calling his films at all socialist. Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, lots of filmmakers will take money from wherever they can find it, you know. I have got a question that I'm going to go to in the chat, but I just wanted to just follow through this thing about the language, because also it seems to me, if you, you know, you go to film school in Paris, there's obviously huge diasporas now, the whole sort of transnational element. I mean, you know, it's much easier to talk to second and third generation Senegalese, Cameroonians or whatever, who may live in Marseille or whatever, if you keep it in French, than the language that they may now have lost. So it seems to me also about, you know, that he's talking wider, you know, that beyond. I mean, so you're nodding as if, yeah, that kind of sounds.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think, you know, we could. It's not clear that the film is set in Cameroon. It's in some sort of dystopian, you know, kind of dilapidated urban, you know, environment. It's clearly future focused. It could be, you know, anywhere in Francophone Africa. It could be anywhere in a future, you know, kind of, I suppose, a future Paris with a very large diasporic, you know, perhaps not with the police, but there are other locations where this imagination could work, I think. And so there is, yes, I think you're right. There is an attempt to almost delocalize the film and give it a more universal flavor, and that's probably part of the use of genre as a kind of language as well, so that not all of the not all of that work about universalizing is done through the verbal and textual language. It's also done through the kind of filmic language.
Yeah, and there's no shot that kind of localizes it anyway. You know, there's no sort of setup. You know, here's the recognizable building or whatever. So I'm going to go to, it's moved up. This question from Rin, which says, what an incredible film. Thank you for showing it. I wanted to ask, you mentioned in the introduction that the film was described as lesbian vampires. What in the film denoted that they were lesbians?
This is really interesting because, I mean, actually, when you look at the, and I think Gareth is very kindly, or somebody's very kindly posted it in there, that the 2012 interview with Bekolo himself, that is how they tag it, and yet he never mentions lesbian vampires at all when he talks about the film. So it almost feels like a bit of a sales pitch. And I kept on waiting, the very first time I watched the film, I kept on waiting for them to kind of, stick their teeth into somebody's neck and start sucking blood, which they never do. And then also for there to be an actual, which would be probably quite groundbreaking in some ways, an actual kind of, lesbian erotic scene. And there really isn't. So I think elsewhere in my slides, I referred to it more as being homoerotic. And I don't think that the film is necessarily implying that Majoli and Chouchou are in what we would think of as a a long-term lesbian relationship. I think in that way, it's more that there is a closeness, a togetherness between the women, which focuses on sexual power. And I think that has probably been misread when trying to think about how you might say, how might you sell this film to a Western audience who are going to have no idea what the Mevoungou is or what is going on with these kind of matriarchs in the background. What could one say that might approximate to something that kind of makes sense? So I would agree with Rin that there isn't very much in the film that denotes that they are lesbians counterposed to to other people who are heterosexual. There is a large group of women who are, I suppose, using a sexual power, a power that's mediated through the body, specifically through the body of women, in order to break out and to break through some of the problematic elements of the post-colonial state, or kind of post-colonial power. And I don't think they're vampires. I didn't see them sucking anybody's blood. I think it's that strange kind of scene at the beginning with the kind of the wooden contraption that floats down from the ceiling, and the very strange kind of gyrating and dancing and so forth. It's almost like a slight, there's something sort of slightly S&M about it, slightly kind of a slightly sort of circus act about it. So it's quite unusual, but I just think it's because the film is slightly indescribable, but describing it as lesbian vampires is about the close that somebody could get to trying to think what they could say about the film to get some people to come and watch it, probably.
Yeah, it feels to me more like a kind of genre film description. Suddenly, from somewhere along the line, just thought, well, then maybe that's a way of marketing it. But it also feels to me a bit like that might be something you said 10 or 15 years ago. But there's been quite a lot of films in the last few years which are kind of girl power films, and girlhood and teenage girls using their kind of their sexuality and in empowering ways that I think it kind of sits differently now than maybe it did 15 years ago. I think I've got another question from the chat. So this is from Malcolm, so thank you, Malcolm. I really enjoyed it. Do you think it relates in some way to classic French films, Godard and Rivette, and particularly Céline and Julie Go Boating? Which, yes, I think this is a good question, as they say.
Yeah,
so
it is
a very good one to you.
It is a very good question, and also kind of Bonnie and Clyde type of thing, I think. So there is a whole, not just in French cinema, but I think also in, Thelma and Louise, there are lots of these kind of movies that are about a slightly marginalized female couple, not necessarily in the sexual sense, but a couple of women doing their thing against both the state and law, and exploring their own bodies with each other, but not necessarily in a way that implies that they are attracted to each other, more in a way that implies that the other woman is a sort of a useful reflector, a useful mirror of the female ego. So I think there's probably something to that, definitely. And given, as David said, that Bekolo's training is very much within the Parisian film schools that he was taught directly by Christian Metz, I think that it's very unlikely that he would not, if not directly influenced, I'm sure that those films would very much be within his kind of psyche, things that he's aware of. But as I say, there are also there are other, I suppose, models of kind of outlaw female women, not just in French cinema, that are probably relevant.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. I mean, I suppose, you know, sort of taking that on a bit, it's also this interrogation of what's meant by, you know, which is the real, and you know, how is film, you know, doing what it does to us. And so I can't, it seems to me absolutely unbelievable he wouldn't have seen some of these films and be, you know, as you said, the kind of training he went through would have been, you know, how can you use film to examine those questions? And so
it does make me think as well, when we were talking about the intertitles, of course, the, you know, the film I should probably have thought of is Les Chinoises by Godard, which uses quite a lot of kind of, you know, textual kind of, and they're big questions as well, and they are also challenging questions to the audience that deliberately break that that kind of fourth wall and play with the idea of cinema. So, you know, it's not particularly avant-garde in some ways. It's been done before, but I think it hasn't been done before in this kind of context of bricolage. It's been done much more in a context of something quite iterative about a particular kind of politics, a particular point in time.
Yeah. Okay, so have we got any more questions from anybody? Was anybody gonna put hands up or put anything into the chat? So I mean, I'm thinking that we will wrap up with one more question to you, Rachel, which is really just to tell us a bit more about him. I mean, you know, not because he's obviously not just a filmmaker. He's obviously, in a sense, an engaged intellectual in quite a few different ways. You know, what's he up to now? You know, you talked about projects that he could shoot but never get made. I mean, what, you know, to me, his films all seem a few years old, so I don't know quite know what he's doing.
The most recent one that he made was called Africa, la pensée en mouvement, Afrique, la pensée en mouvement. So Africa, thought in movement. It's becoming much more philosophical in some ways, and I think that's building on some of the things that he talked about in his 2009 book. He's had most recently appointments at I can't remember which universities in the States, but actually quite long sort of filmmaker in residence, or indeed a kind of visiting lecturer on film appointments. I'm not aware of him having anything kind of in post-production at the moment, or indeed him being out on a film shoot at the moment. He has often done kind of jobbing work in fallow periods on Canadian TV. He has quite a lot of his family, including an older brother who are based in Canada. And I think that his parents retired to Canada, I think. Certainly his mother was there for a year or so when he was younger. His father was actually, interestingly, something quite high up in the Cameroonian police force when he was growing up. I have no idea. I assume they're not still alive. But he has these very, very strong links with Canada and with North America. And I haven't heard, I mean, often you kind of read in the various kind of, trade mags that are around about things that people are doing. And I haven't heard about what he's doing at the moment. So I'd be interested to know, where this is going. There's been less feature filmmaking, and his film from 2013, Le Président, made it quite difficult for him to shoot films again in Cameroon. That's been censored, banned, excoriated really in the state press in Cameroon, because very, very critical of Paul Biya, who remains the president, has been president since 1983, I think, and not moved on. And the film itself, Le Président from 2013, actually asked the question, when does one decide to step down? So it's actually just basically saying you may be a good man, but you've been here way too long. Made him very unpopular. So I wonder if there are some blockers subsequent to that it's actually more difficult to get back to film perhaps than it would have been previously.
Sounds like it. Sounds like a place you don't want to be on the wrong side of the president if you want to get some money to make a film. But okay, thank you very much. I mean, just to say, I mean, the references have been put in the chat if people want to investigate a bit more. And I think the film you mentioned, Aristotle's Plot, is available and around on YouTube. I'm not sure that any of his others are, without delving into, do you know if any of them are on DVD or anything?
Quartier Mozart is often on DVD. Quartier Mozart was, Aristotle's Plot is available because it was made in response to a British Film Institute call for films about Africa in the new century, I think. And it's part of a suite of films by various different filmmakers. And Bekolo was chosen as the representative of Africa, which is partly why it's quite really intriguing film, kind of quite philosophical, quite aesthetic as well. It's responding to that quite kind of intellectualized inquiry into what cinema is. But I think that Quartier Mozart definitely was around on DVD. There used to be a fantastic video shop called Cinéma Trois Mondes in Paris, where you could get all these things from, but I don't think it exists anymore. But certainly a lot of clips of things, so you can get a sense of the film rather than the whole film sometimes exist.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Very, very interesting. Really nice to see you again and to chat some more. And hopefully we might do something again like this next year if we're still online doing these kind of things. Might even look at another one of his films, because I'm, really fascinated by what he's been doing. So thank you very much. I mean, I'll do kind of real life applause, as it were. And, if people want to react, they can.
Well, thanks for having me.
Sort of thing.
Always a pleasure.
Well, I mean, let's hope we meet in a cinema, but that's, another general hope for all of us. Okay, well, good night, everybody, and enjoy the last weekend of the festival. There's still, lots of good films to see, so I'll see you on the other side.